Australia. Just by hearing the name, you can imagine paradisiacal beaches, kangaroos jumping in the red desert, a relaxed lifestyle, sunshine all year round, and people who seem to have no worries. Who hasn't dreamt of crossing the world to visit such a place? However, behind the postcard images, there is a very different Australia from the one that appears in the travel guides. A country where the cost of living suffocates entire families. Aboriginal peoples still face social exclusion. Excessive alcohol consumption creates serious problems, and immigrants seeking asylum end up imprisoned and sent to distant islands in a controversial system. Today, Bello Mundo takes you to this other side of Australia, a reality where many people struggle to pay the rent. Indigenous communities are forgotten, and the homelessness crisis spreads to the big cities. Did you think you knew Australia? Then get ready, because this story goes beyond beaches and kangaroos. Number 1. The Promised Land. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide. When we talk about Australia, it's impossible not to imagine these modern cities, full of gleaming skyscrapers, efficient transportation, and that enviable lifestyle. The beaches are cinematic, the cuisine is a reflection of global immigration, and the coffee culture has become almost a religion in the hippest neighborhoods. Visitors to Sydney, for example, are blown away by the Opera House by the bay, the immense harbour bridge, and the beaches packed with surfers. Melbourne, on the other hand, conquers with its colourful graffiti streets, charming cafes, and an uncontrollable passion for sports. From Australian soccer to Formula One, Adelaide and Perth mix urban charm with proximity to nature, while Brisbane maintains a sunny climate all year round, attracting those looking for a quieter life, but without giving up modernity. What about nature? Well, that part needs no introduction. Australia has the Great Barrier Reef, reddish deserts in the outback, rainforests, and animals that look like they came out of a genetic experiment. Platypuses, wombats, quokkas, and the whole marsupial gang. Not to mention the peculiar Australian accent, the uncomplicated way of life, and the feeling that everything is under control. This is the country that appears in travel guides and on social media, a land of opportunity where you can live by the sea, barbecue at the weekend, and enjoy safety and quality public services. But behind this image of urban paradise lies a far less glamorous reality. A country where the cost of living is squeezed, inequality is growing, and entire communities are struggling not to be forgotten. That's exactly the Australia we're going to explore from now on. Number 2. The story no one tells. Australia's history begins long before the skyscrapers of Sydney or the surfers riding waves at Bondi Beach. Approximately 60,000 years ago, the first Aboriginal peoples arrived on the continent, migrating from Asia. For millennia, they were the only inhabitants of these lands, developing rich cultures, spiritual traditions, and a deep connection with nature. But then the Europeans came, and everything changed. In the 18th century, in 1770, the first British expedition, led by Captain James Cook, arrived in Australian territory. A few decades later, England declared official possession of the land and began one of the most brutal chapters in the country's history, colonization. But Australia wasn't colonized in the traditional way. Unlike the Americas, where Europeans sought gold and fertile land, the British turned the island into a penal colony. In other words, for years, England used the Australian territory as a huge open-air prison, sending thousands of convicts there, many of them for minor crimes. And the Aboriginal peoples? Well, they were practically erased from official history. At the time of colonization, it is estimated that the native population numbered almost 1 million people. But wars, massacres, disease, and policies of forced assimilation drastically reduced this number. Today, Aborigines represent less than 1% of the Australian population and still face serious difficulties in preserving their culture and guaranteeing basic rights. But the country has continued to change. In the 20th century, Australia underwent a process of industrialization, albeit at a slower pace than other powers such as the United States. The big economic leap came with the exploitation of natural resources, minerals, coal, gas, which boosted national wealth and made cities like Perth grow impressively. Another factor that shaped the country's identity was the wave of immigration. After the Second World War, the government opened its doors to European immigrants, and over the decades, people from all over the world sought opportunities there. Today, Sydney and Melbourne are among the most multicultural cities on the planet, with entire neighborhoods dedicated to different ethnicities, typical restaurants and festivals that celebrate this diversity. Sounds like the perfect recipe for a prosperous country, doesn't it? But there's another side to this prosperity, and that's where things get bleak. Number 3. Inequality. Australia may boast a very high GDP, but that doesn't mean that wealth is evenly distributed. In several regions, especially on the outskirts of the big cities and in certain remote locations, the reality is quite different from that of the wealthy. Many people are surprised to discover that around 1 in 10 Australians live in poverty. And we're not just talking about those who are unemployed. There are full-time workers who, even on a fixed income, can't keep up with the high cost of living. Housing, transportation, energy, and education have become luxuries beyond the reach of many families. On the outskirts of the big cities, neighborhoods like Mount Druitt, Blacktown and Fairfield in Sydney, and Broadmeadows, Dandenong and Sunshine in Melbourne face a very different reality from the prime tourist areas. Unemployment, lack of infrastructure, and high crime rates make these places seem worlds apart, far from the image of a prosperous and developed country. And the situation in the cities is even better than in some remote regions. In the outback or northern Australia, access to basic services is a daily challenge. Medical care, rare, quality education, for the few. Poor infrastructure pushes thousands of people to the margins of society in a country that, on paper, should offer opportunities for all. Number 4. Cost of living, between the dream of homeownership and the nightmare of renting. If there's one issue that weighs heavily on Australians' pockets, it's the cost of living, especially when it comes to housing. Buying a house, for many, it's become a distant dream. The average price of a property in Sydney has already passed the $1 million mark. And we're not talking about luxury mansions by the sea, but ordinary houses, often old ones, which have only been inflated over the years. And those who can't buy, rent. But it's not that simple either. The prices are surreal. A one-bedroom apartment in the center of Sydney or Melbourne can cost thousands of dollars a month. To give you an idea, according to the Numbeo website, rent in Sydney is already over $4,000 a month. Melbourne is a little cheaper, but still over $2,500. Now, you might think, but salaries in Australia are high. Well, not everyone earns well. The minimum wage in the country is around $23 an hour, which works out at around 3,000 Australian dollars a month. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? But when you put rent, transportation, electricity and water bills, food and other basic expenses on the table, it's clear that the bill just doesn't add up. And when it doesn't, what happens? Simple. More and more Australians have nowhere else to live. Number 5. The homeless crisis. You may be shocked to discover that cities like Sydney or Melbourne have a growing number of homeless people, especially after the pandemic, which has exacerbated the housing crisis. There are entire camps of people who simply have nowhere to live. whether they are Australian citizens or foreigners who have been left out by the system. Under viaducts, in public parks or parking lots, there are makeshift shantytowns made of tarpaulin or recycled material, where families try to protect themselves from the cold, rain, or scorching heat. If you think homeless people are just people without jobs or addicted to drugs, forget that stereotype. Australia's high cost of living has led to the emergence of a new group of people called the working homeless. Workers with steady jobs, often with 2 or 3 jobs, who still can't afford permanent housing. Many end up living in cars, trailers, or even tents because there are simply no affordable options. The worst thing is that social assistance can't take care of everyone. Shelters are overcrowded, charitable organizations are overwhelmed, and the homeless often have to fight against prejudice and violence. It's common to hear reports of aggression and hostility. The dream Australian lifestyle of a spacious house by the beach, a barbecue, and a beer in the evening is far from accessible to everyone. Number 6. Alcohol problems. Speaking of beer, this is another subject that can't be ignored when we talk about the dark side of Australia. Alcoholism. Since the early days of colonization, alcohol has played a curious role in Australia. During the 19th century, there were places where booze was used almost as currency, and this historical relationship seems to have ingrained a pattern of consumption that to this day causes headaches. It's no wonder that Australia constantly appears in the rankings of countries with the highest rates of alcohol consumption per person. In many cities, the pint-after-work culture is nothing to take lightly. Whole groups gather in pubs and stay out until the early hours of the morning, turning the night into a night that goes beyond leisure. This is reflected in statistics on domestic violence, street fights, and health problems. In northern regions such as Darwin, it is common to see no alcohol signs on the streets as the police try to control conflicts caused by drunkenness. For the Aborigines, alcohol was and is a devastating weapon. Many communities suffer from extremely high rates of alcoholism, the result of social abandonment and historical trauma. And in the midst of this excess, there are everyday tragedies that don't fit at all with the image of a relaxed, carefree country. Number 7. Coober Pedy, an entire town built underground. Coober Pedy is located in South Australia's interior, in the heart of the famous outback. The region is marked by a vast expanse of arid land, dry hills, and an open sky that seems to have no end. With around 3,000 inhabitants, the place impresses not only with its desolate landscape of sand pyramids, but also with the white tubes that rise from the ground. Sounds strange, right? But these pipes are actually ventilation shafts for the underground houses, the famous dugouts. They ensure air circulation, relieving the suffocating heat that can turn the desert into a real oven. But why, after all, have so many people decided to bury themselves underground? The answer goes back to the end of the First World War, when soldiers experienced in mining and used to extreme conditions returned home. Upon arriving in Coober Pedy, these veterans applied their skills to create underground dwellings that would protect them from the extreme desert temperatures. And so a city was born underground. But if you think these houses are just simple holes in the ground, you need to review your concepts. They're not simple at all. With houses built at least 4 meters deep to prevent landslides, the residents not only find relief from the scorching desert heat, but also enjoy a more economical and sustainable life. Thanks to solar and wind energy, the city is able to generate all the electricity it needs. Meanwhile, those living above ground pay dearly for essential air conditioning, an unnecessary luxury for those living in the dugouts. And the benefits don't stop there. Underground homes are much more affordable. But if you want to know more about Coober Pedy, there's a full video here on the channel, so go and watch it after this one. Number 8. Racism and the treatment of Aborigines. And here we must emphasize that we are talking about the oldest living culture on the planet, with over 60,000 years of history. People who inhabited this land long before the arrival of the British, developing profound knowledge of nature, spiritual rituals, and their own forms of organization. But with colonization, this legacy was not celebrated. It was forcibly erased. Since then, Aboriginal people have been marginalized, persecuted, and subjected to brutal policies that, in many cases, simply sought to make them disappear. For decades, the government promoted the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families, a period known as the Stolen Generations, in an attempt to assimilate them into white society. Today, the situation is still far from fair. Sanitation is lacking, education is precarious, access to health care is limited, and the incarceration rate of young Aboriginal people is far higher than that of young white people, showing that the system hasn't changed all that much. From time to time, protests and demonstrations gain momentum, with Aboriginal leaders calling for so-called reconciliation, a process to try to make amends for past mistakes and guarantee equal rights. But in practice, the social gap remains huge. And if you think this exclusion is a thing of the past, look at this absurdity. In 2023, Australia held a referendum to include Aboriginal peoples in the Constitution and create an Indigenous advisory body to advise Parliament. The result? The majority of the population voted against it. That's right, a country that sells itself as multicultural and modern has denied official recognition to its indigenous peoples. While tourists pay a lot of money to visit Uluru, Ayers Rock, and hear stories about Aboriginal culture, the indigenous communities themselves remain forgotten, without decent housing, jobs, or real recognition. A stark contrast for a country that loves to promote itself as welcoming and inclusive. Number 9. Immigration and the controversial island of Nauru. But do you think this prejudice is only against indigenous peoples? Not by a long shot. Australia loves to sell itself as a multicultural country, open to the world, a true paradise for immigrants. And yes, many people arrive there every year to study, work, or try to make a better life for themselves. But if you're not European or don't fall within the acceptable categories, the story changes. The Australian government has a policy that practically throws out anyone who tries to enter the country by boat. Instead of taking these people in, as many countries do, Australia simply sends asylum seekers to remote detention centers where they stay indefinitely, without knowing what will happen to their lives. And one of the most controversial cases of this strategy is the island of Nauru, an isolated piece of land in the middle of the Pacific that has become a prison for unwanted immigrants. And what happens there? Well, it's ugly. Reports from those who have been to Nauru speak of a lack of medical care, terrible living conditions, psychological abuse, and, in some cases, even physical violence. For many, this is not a reception center, but an open-air prison. The government defends this policy by saying that it is to protect the borders and prevent the arrival of illegal boats. But in practice, this means that thousands of families, including children, are thrown into this legal limbo, forgotten to their fate. Meanwhile, the UN, the International Criminal Court, and human rights groups such as Amnesty International have condemned this strategy several times. And if you want to know more about the island of Nauru, there's a full video here on the channel explaining how the Australian government pays millions to keep these people imprisoned in degrading conditions. At the end of the day, Australia may like to boast that it is a welcoming and fair nation, but you only have to look at these policies to realize that, For many people, the treatment is very different from what appears on the postcards. And that's it for today. What did you think of this lesser-known side of one of the world's most desirable destinations? Have you had any experience in the land of the kangaroos? Were you surprised by the stories you discovered today? Send me your comments because I really want to know what you think. If you like to see the world from an angle that no one else shows, stay tuned to Bello Mundo. There's still a lot that the conventional tour doesn't tell you.